Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 33 from the Ecce textbook, and we're going to dive into the grammar involved. So we're going to look at some derivatives to start like we normally do, try to associate some English words that come from the Latin so you can just learn the words a little better, and hopefully it'll help you with your vocab. Then we're going to dive into the grammar. In this chapter, the grammar is on participles, and specifically the perfect passive participle. So we're going to dive into what participles are, what a perfect passive participle is, and just try to get a sense of it so that we can move through this chapter and you'll be able to translate the story and kind of pick up this grammar as you go. To start, though, we want to look at some derivatives. So the first derivative we're going to look at is the word pestilentia, which means plague, or pestilence is the derivative we get in English, right? It comes right from this word. It means the same thing. A pestilence is basically a plague, right? The next word we want to look at is locus, which means place. Now, this is actually an interesting word in Latin because it gives us a lot of English derivatives. You get words like locus, which you actually can say in English. It means a place. Location, local, locomotive, locate. They all come from this one Latin word. So it's a good one to know just so you can see all the English derivatives that come from it. Next, we have edo esse, right? So esse means to eat. And it looks like esse, right? The verb to be, but it has the long E. So the verb to eat here is where we get the word edible from. And you can see that with the first principal part of edo, right? Meaning to eat, or I eat rather. And it's where you get edible, which means the same thing. If something's edible, it means you're able to eat it. Next, we have complere, right? Now, this is where we get words in English like complete, completion, accomplish, complement, comply. They're all coming from this same Latin verb. So it's a good one to know. And lastly, we have scindere, right? Meaning to cut. And this is where we get words like rescind or even scythe in English. They both have to do with cutting. So there's a lot of words in English that come from this one Latin verb. And again, it's the idea of cutting something. So next we want to look at the grammar, like I said. The grammar we're going to start with is on participles. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is a participle, right? A participle is a verbal adjective, which sounds kind of odd. And again, if you're not big on grammar or grammar terms or grammar rules, this might take a little bit of getting used to, but the idea is actually pretty simple. You can use an adjective, a verb like an adjective. That's what it means to be a verbal adjective. It sounds simple, but this is how it works. If you were to say in English, the closed door cannot be opened, right? Imagine a door that's closed. What's happening here? The door is being described as closed, right? It's a closed door. The problem is closed comes from a verb, to close. So what you're seeing here is a verb, to close, being used as an adjective. This is what we're talking about with a participle, a verbal adjective, right? That verb, to close, is being used to describe the door, which is a noun. That's really what we're getting at here. So once you can kind of wrap your head around that, because it sounds odd using a verb as an adjective, it is possible, right? Particularly in Latin and English, we don't use these so much, but Latin loves participles and uses them a lot. So you want to kind of wrap your head around the idea that you can use a Latin verb to describe a noun, right? That's what a participle is. So if we think back to our Latin verbs, you want to remember they have four pieces, which we call the principal parts. So here I gave you the verb videre, to see, right? So you have video, videre, vidi, visus. The four parts are things that we've seen a lot, right? In the first 33 chapters of Ecce, we've been seeing this a lot. The one we haven't really spoken about that much is the fourth principal part. But if you break these down, we know that the first part, video, means I see. It's the first person singular in the present tense. The second principal part is the present active infinitive, to see. The third principal part is the first person singular perfect tense, is a type of that. It should say perfect tense, which means I saw, right? That fourth principal part, visus here, is what we call a perfect passive participle, right? That's what we're going for in this chapter. It's a participle, but we've used it in another way so far. But you want to just think about what the different pieces mean. And again, this should sound familiar because we've already seen the fourth principal part. We already learned it, right? Back in chapter 32. So this should be something that sounds very familiar to you. We use those fourth principal parts, right, which were participles. We use them to create the passive voice of the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses, right? So, for example, if we come back to the verb videre, you learned how to turn that fourth principal part, visus, into visus sum, visus eram, and visus ero. So you're saying, I have been seen, right? Perfect tense, passive voice. I had been seen, pluperfect tense, passive voice. And I will have been seen, which is future perfect tense, passive voice, right? So this is what we were doing last chapter. What we're going to see in this chapter, though, is that you can use the fourth principal part in another way. right? So when you use that fourth principal part to form the passive voice, it's always in the nominative case because it's agreeing with the subject. So that when you're not using it for passive voice, though, it's called a perfect passive participle, the PPP, right, which is what we abbreviated here, it can be used in any case. So that's a key difference of what's going on here, right? But we can even think more critically about this. When you have the fourth principal part going with esse, the verb to be, that's when you're using the passive voice for perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tense, right? That's what it is. It has to have esse going with it. That's what we did last chapter in chapter 32. When you have a fourth principal part on its own, it's a PPP. It's a perfect passive participle. So that's the difference, right? So now this all begs the question, what is a perfect passive participle, right? It might be a little confusing so far, but what is it? What do we keep talking about? Well, perfect passive participles are kind of what they sound like. They're passive in meaning, right? They're participles, so they're verbal adjectives, and they're passive in meaning. They use first and second declension adjective endings. So in other words, they end in us, a, So if you take a look at that fourth principal part of a Latin verb, you're going to see the us, a, ending. That's because it's using adjective endings, which makes sense because it's a verbal adjective. So they're used to describe nouns, right? They're adjectives. That's the whole idea. They match their noun in three ways: case, number, and gender, just like an adjective would, right? So they have to match in case, number, and gender. The reason they're called perfect passive participles is because they're expressing an action that happened before the main part of the verb, right? That's why we call them perfect. The easiest translation is having been. There's a couple other ways to do it, but in general, you would say things like having been closed, right? So if you think back to that example I gave you at the beginning, the closed door, what I'm really saying is the door having been closed, right? That's another way to say it. Having been usually gets you in the right place in terms of how to translate it, but there's other ways to do it too that we'll look at. But I think it's easiest to look at some examples, right? So hopefully you go back, pause this video, go back and write some notes if you need to on what the perfect passive participle is or what a participle is in general. But I think it's easiest to see it in action, right? So here we have a sentence that comes from the Ecce story. You have quoquis vocatus ab omnibus laudatus est. You have two fourth principal parts happening here: vocatus and laudatus, right? So vocatus comes from vocare, to call, and laudatus comes from laudare, to praise. So they're both fourth principal parts, but they're being used in different ways. So if we look at them again, right, vocatus is a PPP. There's no esse going with it. It's just a fourth principal part by itself. It's a perfect passive participle. Laudatus, on the other hand, has esse going with it, est, right? It's the present tense of esse. This makes it passive voice, perfect tense. So even though they look similar, they're doing two different things. So again, even though they look similar, they're doing two different things, and this is how you can tell them apart. Look for the verb esse, right? If there's no esse going with the fourth principal part, it's going to be a perfect passive participle. If there is esse going with it, it's just going to be the passive voice of either perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tense, depending on what tense the esse is, right? If it's est, erat, or erit, that's kind of what we're talking about. That'll tell you what tense is in the passive voice. So how do we translate these? Well, vocatus is a perfect passive participle. So you translate it having been called, right? That's what we said. There's other ways you can do it, but the most basic way is to say having been called. Laudatus est, on the other hand, is saying he, she, or it was praised or has been praised is another way to say it, right? It's describing the cook. So the PPP is having been something. The fourth principal part with esse, right, is just passive voice of one of the tenses we just described. So they're translated in different ways. Even though they are both coming from that fourth principal part, there is a major difference. So you want to just think about that as you go. So if we were to translate this sentence, right, you'd say the cook, having been called, was praised by everyone, right? Vocatus is my PPP. It's describing the cook, right? It's not just any cook. It's the cook who was called, having been called, right, is what we're getting at here. It's working as a verbal adjective, right? So it's the verb to call, but it's describing something. I am describing the cook. It's not just any cook. It's the cook that was called, right? That's the one way to think about it. So another way you can think about it is in terms of timing, right? What's happening here? So a key note you want to get on perfect passive participles is they're describing an action that happens before the main verb, right? So the participle is not the main verb in your sentence, right? In this case, laudatus est is my main verb. The participle, though, the PPP, is telling you something happened before the main verb. So in other words, what happened first? Did the cook get called in or did he get praised? Well, since the participle is vocatus, the PPP, that's the first action. So first, he was called in and then he was praised by everyone, right? So there's a sequencing happening here in terms of timing. The perfect passive participle, right? Remember, it's perfect passive, meaning it's got that past element to it. It's describing an action that happened before the main verb. That's what's going on here. So first the cook was called in, right? And then he was praised by everyone. So let's think about other translations. Remember, I told you don't have to translate it as having been. So you could say the cook having been called, or you could say the cook after being called, the cook when called, or you could even do it with a relative pronoun, which is what English likes to do. The cook who had been called, right? All of these are getting at the idea that the cook was called before he was praised, right? And again, Latin loves the participle. You can see in the last one in English, we tend to use relative pronouns, right? The cook who had been called, right? A relative clause. That's what we use more often than not in English. But in Latin, it's more condensed, right? The participle is letting you say something that would take 3 or 4 words in English in only 1 word in Latin. Right? And it's getting at the same idea. The meaning is the same. So again, there's a couple different ways to translate it. It doesn't really matter which one you use. I like to use having been, but as long as you're using one of these and you're getting at the idea that this happened already, right, you're going to be fine. And you have to keep it passive voice too. Remember, it's not the cook calling someone. The cook is being called. So just keep that passive element and you'll be okay. The other thing to think about, I told you, is case, number, and gender. Right? And you want to notice here, the PPP, vocatus, is matching coquus, right? The cook in case, number, and gender. They're both nominative, singular, and masculine. So the PPP is working as an adjective. So whatever my noun is that I'm describing, that's going to be the case, number, and gender that I match. So if you see here, if I change it around, right, here we have amici invitati. Now they're both masculine, nominative, plural, right? I'm using invitati because I'm describing the amici, the friends, right, having been invited to dinner, and it keeps going from there. It's a different case, number, and gender. I could also use something like this. Here we have porky and skissy, right? I'm saying the meat of the pig having been cut. Right? They're both masculine, genitive, singular, because I'm describing porky with my verbal adjective of skissy, right? It's coming from skindere, the verb to cut, but I'm using it as an adjective. That's the idea here. And one last one, you could use uwai, right? Grapes. It would be portata, the grapes having been carried or brought into the triclinium. They're both feminine, nominative, plural. So again, the participle, because it's working as an adjective, has to match its noun in case, number, and gender. It's a straightforward idea. We've been doing this a lot, in the first 32, now 33 chapters of Ecce. So hopefully that idea makes sense to you. Whenever we have adjectives, they need to match in case, number, gender. The tricky part here is you've got to remember a participle is a verbal adjective. So it's still going to match in case, number, and gender. So now we want to shift gears a little bit and think about perfect passive participles and how they're used with the ablative case. And specifically, we're going to look at 2 ways that the ablative is used here, the ablative of agent and the ablative of means. So if we think back to when we dealt with passive voice, right, you want to remember that we said the ablative case is used to show who or what is doing the action. And we call it either the ablative of agent or the ablative of means, depending on, who or what is doing the action. So here's an example. If you said Ancilla, vocata ab Aurelia laudata est, I'm saying the slave woman, the Ancilla, having been summoned, was praised, laudata est. Well, who summoned or who called the slave woman? Aurelia did, right? Here we're using the ablative. We have ab Aurelia, having been summoned by Aurelia. This is what we call the ablative of agent, right? I'm saying who called the slave woman? Aurelia did. We use the preposition ab. It could be a, the long a, if there were a consonant in front of it. But since Aurelia starts with a vowel, we have ab, right? And I'm showing who called the slave woman. It's just like what we did with passive voice the past few chapters. Same idea applies here. This is the ablative of agent. I'm just telling you who called the slave woman. Here's another example. If I said miles, gladio vulneratus relictus est, I'm saying the soldier, the miles, right, having been wounded, vulneratus, okay? Now, I'm trying to say not who wounded the soldier, but what wounded the soldier, right? In what way was the soldier wounded is kind of another way to think about it, or in what means, by what means was the soldier wounded? I'm saying how was he wounded? Gladio, with a sword or by the sword. That's the ablative of means, right? Having been wounded by the sword or having been wounded with a sword, I'm describing how this soldier was wounded. This is what we call the ablative of means. And it's not a person, it's a thing is really what it is. When you're using the ablative of means, you're not using the preposition. So there's no preposition going with it. There's no a or ob. It's just gladio, right? A noun in the ablative case. So just a quick recap. When you're dealing with the ablative case in PPPs, right, if you're using the ablative of agent, that's when the action of the participle is done by a person, and it's going to go with a or ob, just like we saw in the example. If you're using the ablative of means, that's when the action is done by a thing, right? Think the sword. There's no preposition involved. So it's always good to step back and just make sure you understand how the ablative case is used with PPPs. It's the same concept as what we've been doing with passive voice for the past few chapters. Same thing applies to these perfect passive participles, because like the name implies, they are passive, right? They're verbs. They have that verbal element, and they have a passive voice to them. So basically the same idea is applying here. So let's just do a quick recap of what we saw in this video, right? Because there's a lot coming at you. You want to remember a few things. Participles are verbal adjectives. They are adjectives that come from verbs. You got to wrap your head around that idea. It's not too complicated, but it does take a little bit to really understand. The fourth principal part of a verb is its participle, right? That's where we get these participles from. When you have the fourth principal part and it's going with esse, right? That's how we form the passive voice of perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tense. So the fourth principal part plus esse is passive voice of those three tenses. When you have the fourth principal part on its own, meaning the verb to be is not going with it, there's no esse, this is the perfect passive participle, which is really what we're getting at in this chapter, right? The PPP, we abbreviated. Perfect passive participles are passive, right? Just like the name implies. And they have their own case, number, and gender because they're adjectives, right? They're going to match their noun in case, number, and gender. They're often translated as having been blanked, right? Having been summoned, having been called, having been praised, whatever you're saying. There's other ways to do it, though. That's just sort of the basic translation, but there's a couple different ways to do it. As long as you're keeping that passive element and the perfect element, you're going to be fine. And remember, because they are perfect passive participles, they represent actions that happen before the main verb. Right? So they didn't happen at the same time or in the future, they happened before. That's the sequencing of the tenses, the timing that we're getting at here, right? The perfect passive participle always happens first. And they often go with the ablative case. That ablative case is either going to be the ablative of means or the ablative of agent, depending on who or what is doing the action of the PPP, right? If it's a person, ablative of agent, and it has the preposition a or ob. If it's a thing, the ablative of means, no preposition involved, right? So if you can just recap this. And this is just to give you a basic overview to go along with your notes and the Ecce textbook. But if you can kind of do a quick recap in your head and really focus on the PPP and understand these basic elements of it, you're going to be fine. The best thing you can do is practice. Get as much reading and translation as you possibly can, because otherwise it's just going to be an abstract grammar idea. You really need to see it in action. I know I gave you a few examples in this video, but there's a lot more you can get from the textbook. You want to work through all of them, do as much as you possibly can, and the more you work on it, the more it's going to make sense to you.